The UFC and USADA announced their not so amicable divorce this year, effective, like a few days from now. I'm not really one to watch. After 8 years, the UFC decided to go in another direction, and now their athletes will be tested by Drug Free Sport International. According to USADA CEO Travis Tigert, the partnership had become untenable. That's what he said. UFC executive Hunter Campbell stated that USADA's handling of Conor McGregor's return to the testing pool as disgusting. Guys, what do you think of this whole ugly mess, the way it ended? Do you side with the UFC or USADA? Nolan?
It was definitely interesting to see it play out. I don't know if I can really take a side, but I will say I think that USADA came across to me as a bit surprisingly unprofessional given like their standing in this whole the way that this system's set up, right? For the UFC side, I mean, we've seen Dana White, we've seen, the promotion itself kind of at times be a bit unprofessional, but I think that comes with the territory of a promoter is going to say things that promote fights. There's certain bodies that are involved in the system that are supposed to stay as kind of the mediators of right and wrong. And so for me, if USADA was supposed to be regulating the UFC, I felt like that statement they put out was surprisingly kind of like taking shots. And it would to me, I get it to a certain degree. Maybe they felt like their integrity was being challenged behind the scenes. We don't necessarily know all the details of everything that was going on in the backroom discussions. But I did feel like there was a lot of conflated issues in that statement. It seemed like it mixed in Connor with the termination of their deal. Were those things related? It seemed like Tyson Tigart was a bit hesitant to explicitly say that in some of the interviews that I read with him. So for me, I definitely think like going into the situation, was I surprised by what the UFC was doing? No, not really. Was I surprised by the way USADA was handling it? I was a bit. So I don't know if there's winners or losers here. I think that some of the things Hunter Campbell and Jeff Nowitzki were saying at that press conference, I agree with. I think having fighters have to, test the night before weigh-ins in the middle of the night when they're trying to sleep and cut weight, stuff like that. Does that make sense? Was some of the things that USADA, there was a number of different things USADA was doing that didn't seem very practical. It seemed to at times be detrimental to the fighters, right? I mean, we've seen how many drugs, it took a long time for some of these substances that were eventually deemed to be, tainted supplements or the pulsing issues, things like that, for them to incorporate rules and boundaries where it seemed to me that drug testing kind of at times, and people could make the greater argument for it, that there are arbitrary lines drawn in this whole thing. So I understand some of the aspects of what the UFC was hoping for out of USADA that they didn't get, or that it took too long, or that maybe they were butting heads in that regard. We don't really know much about the program that's coming up. It does seem like it's self-run. George Piro, the former interrogator for the U.S., he was one of the guys that questioned Saddam Hussein. He's going to be running it. He's a very heavily, he seems like a guy that's passionate about combat sports, about jiu-jitsu, but let's see what he has to offer about drug testing, right? I don't know. I don't think, to my knowledge, he has any sort of experience doing that. So I do like some of the changes that the UFC has mentioned, but I also think there are some red flags when it comes to them having like an employee run it versus kind of a totally independent body. So I kind of have to wait to see how things play out to really give you a gauge. I think my understanding is George Piro is going to at some point talk to the media. I don't know when that will be, if it will be just select kind of interviews or if he'll do like a press conference sort of thing. That's what I'm hoping for as well. So hopefully we get some more things answered when he takes over on January 1st.
Mm-hmm. All right, goes. They were referred to as the gold standard when they first shook hands about 8 years ago. I remember you and I went to the Red Rock when they made this announcement. I remember Lorenzo Fertitta saying, "It's over. You can't use anything. If you use it, you will get caught." But now it is over. So who do you side with, man, the way this went down, UFC or USADA?
Well, I mean, I think they were the gold standard when all this started, right? But since then, there's been a lot of companies that have come up, and there's more options. And so when you start weighing down some of the things that USADA did that the fighters didn't really like, they just seem like common sense things that could have been fixed fairly easily, and they weren't. at the same time, is it really the UFC that's just blown away that their fighters weren't treated well? Like, I don't know, man. I think there's a little bit of blame to go on both sides. I think when Conor McGregor's running around saying the things that he's saying, a good partner would probably put their foot down and say, no, it's not like that. This is the way it really is, and that would probably take some stress off of USADA, right? And the things that they have to answer for. So I think both of them could have probably done some stuff, but I agree with Nolan in the sense that the way USADA handled things, it did not come off very well. It just looked like a very, very bad breakup and very unprofessional in some of those things they said. And the UFC, on the flip side, their press conference, I was really impressed with that. I thought a lot of good information came out of that. I think Hunter Campbell and Jeff Nowitzki kind of held their, you could tell they were upset at times, but they kind of held their cool and gave us a lot of answers and gave us some sort of direction. What happens with George Piro going forward? I love the fact that he loves combat sports and he has a good record when you talk to people who have worked with him in the past. Hopefully, things will play out in a positive nature for mixed martial arts and for the fighters because I do think it is a really big deal. But we kind of have to let it play out first and see what happens.
Mike Bond, do you have any concerns with the UFC kind of running its own drug testing program? Like, it does seem like George Piro is an employee of the UFC. I know that the Drug Free Sport International has already been a part of the collecting process for USADA. So there's some good sense there's some good stuff that comes out of this in the familiarity of how the programs run. Maybe clean it up a little bit along the way. Like Go said, common sense. Does it need to be 6 a.m.? Whatever. But your thoughts on just the fact that it does seem to be, a UFC guy that's going to be running this program?
Yeah, there's definitely like a few red flags there. I guess these are things we can ask George whenever we finally get the opportunity to speak to him. But yeah, I mean, like, does it give me more pause than the UFC's relationship with USADA and the fact that they were giving them all this money, and that even though it's supposed to be like independent, there was clearly still some things that went on as far as like the influence and how the program is structured. And, like they did have, if they wanted to allow Conor McGregor to come back and give him that exemption, they could have. They gave it to Brock Lesnar and it backfired on them. There's clearly like instances of, the stuff that happened with like John Jones and, them relocating an event. I know that was like more athletic commission based in terms of location, but there is like some sway that they had because of like the nature of the relationship. So I think that just continues in a way, but just from a different dynamic, right? So I think everyone still kind of needs to keep their ears up and all that kind of stuff, and just like take a look around at some things that happen as this unfolds. Is it kind of being suspiciously run? Is there maybe a little bit too much like synchronicity between the UFC and how this is run as far as that being like independent? So yeah, there is concerns there. I'm sure they will get asked about them over time, but yeah, is it just going to be one of those things where they're able to just make changes at the snap of a finger because they don't really have anyone to adhere to? Whereas it seemed like, USADA at least had some history behind it, some precedent for certain things. How much of that are they going to pick up on, and how much are they just going to scratch aside and just kind of do it willy-nilly? Those are the bigger concerns on my end.